Before I start, I just wanted to make a brief introduction and give some background. So I'm a pitch consultant, and how I got into this business is I spent 15 years as an investor and operator at another venture firm called Lux Capital. And over that entire duration of helping to build the firm and working internally and working with tons of companies, I was constantly shocked by how many really intelligent people really sucked at talking to us. And it was kind of bewildering to me, almost like as an engineering mindset, like what's wrong with this problem? Because these people get it. They know this is important. They know that quite literally millions of dollars can be on the line based on the impression that they make in these meetings with investors. And yet, time and time and time again, utter failure to connect. And I put a lot of thought into this. I found myself kind of gravitating towards working on this problem. I worked a lot with Lux on its story for its LPs. From when I joined Lux, we were less than 100 million AUM. We were over 4 billion when I left. And I worked with a lot of our companies where we invested in a lot of frontier tech like Khosla, and especially for like more technical founders, this was a really acute problem where we would find that we had very high conviction in a company, yet we felt like we could tell the story better than they could when they were going out for the next round. And this was a problem. And I found myself like working closely with these companies and absolutely loving the work, which ultimately led to what I'm doing today. But in terms of why this is a hard problem, first of all, I want to say I have just such a huge level of respect for what you all do. And the absolute best part of my job is getting to work with people like you. It's such a privilege, and there's so much uncertainty and so much challenge and so many obstacles that you have to overcome. It's such a pleasure to get to work with you, so thank you for being here. And I know your time is very limited, and I think that's one of the big challenges in developing a hard pitch is time. This is something that takes a lot of time. I think to get good at this, it's not something that just happens overnight. It's not like you magically come up with some great idea and all of a sudden your pitch is done, your deck is done, you're great. It's something that is a process. It's something that you iterate upon. It's something you learn over time. You see what's working. And so it takes time, and you have to invest in it. You also have to synthesize all these other components. And one of them, of course, is the technology you're working on and the market and the business you're in, and you're usually pretty competent with that. There's a creative piece of figuring out how to communicate something that might be more technical to a broader audience or how to visualize that. Some people have that. Some people need help with that. And then there's really the investor perspective. And I think that's very difficult for founders to get for a lot of different reasons. Oftentimes when you're pitching, you don't really get the real reason why an investor passed. They might give you a reason. The pass is real, but the reason might not be real. So it's hard to get that direct advice. It's also hard to get exposure to tons of other companies and understand how investor decision processes work. And so I was very fortunate to be in that room and see thousands of pitches, and my hope is to share some of that perspective on how investors make decisions with you today. And by the way, like last year, I spoke about the importance of storytelling and capturing attention. And if you want to see that talk, it's on the Khosla website, so I didn't want to repeat a lot of that content this year. I also gave a workshop, which I think is available online, but I'll check, specifically on pitch decks, which hopefully will be available as a reference. But I'm not talking about those things specifically today. Today, I want to talk about something very tactical, which is the tools you can use to frame your story in a way that's going to make an investor care. But before that, I just want to talk about an analogy that I have a little beef with, which is this idea that startups are a roller coaster or a rocket ship. Now, I agree that things can move really fast, and the ride can be bumpy at times, and things can also end with utter catastrophe. But I have an engineering background, engineering mindset. The problem with this analogy is that, of course, in a roller coaster and with a rocket ship, all the potential energy for that ride is stored at the very beginning of that trip. The fuel on the rocket pad. And that's, of course, not how it works in the real world of startups. In startups, I think of it more like planetary formation. You are in the vastness of space, and there is like nothing but this insignificant speck of dust and ice that is you and your idea. And to get large over time, to build mass, you have to attract resources. And that happens sometimes naturally through collisions, but often through the force of gravity, particularly as you get longer. So it's this process of bringing in capital and talent and partners. And as you get bigger and bigger, it often becomes easier to do those things. By the way, I love that Steve Jobs quote, making a dent in the universe. This is the only way to make a dent in the universe, truly, is to bend space-time with a huge amount of gravity, of mass. And to me, a great pitch is like this hack of the universe, where you can twist that gravity dial to be a little stronger. Your attractive force is greater, and you are more likely to have success in attracting capital, but not just capital, attracting talent, attracting partners. And even if you don't convert to get that deal or that contract on that first meeting, if you have a very good pitch, a very compelling pitch, a memorable pitch, it's like this little virus that lives in people's heads that's much more likely to stick around. And when they're in some other meeting at some other time in the future, totally disconnected from you and that one meeting, they might remember your story. They'll be more likely to remember your pitch and make that connection that could make your business. Maybe it's to another investor, maybe it's to somebody who works for a potentially huge customer of yours. And this is how these little magical things happen in the world. And so you can increase your luck a little bit, I think, by having a much better pitch. And so if I can leave you with one thing, it's worth your time to focus on this. So the goals for today. This is a workshop, and I am going to have you do work. So if you came here just to listen, sorry. You're going to have to do some work. And I want to do two things, which is share these frameworks and concepts and some examples to support those, and then have you actually start putting those to practice. And I want to kind of give you insight into how I think and I work with companies when we start doing sessions together or talking together. And over the course of this, as you see these examples and hear these frameworks, I want you to think about your own story, your own pitch, and how you are going to implement these things. So framing your pitch. I think one of the first things that I'm struck by when I talk to a lot of companies is how hard this first problem is. It's not like the 20-page slide deck or like the technology or any of that. It's how do you really simplify the message in a way that immediately gives someone the right frame of reference for understanding the opportunity. And for an investor, the way they look at the world might be different than how you think they look at the world. And Keith yesterday spoke about building companies is kind of like producing movies, where you have like all these different characters and pieces you have to pull together, and there's the capital and the risk and the uncertainty. And to me, like the frame of your pitch is kind of like the establishing shot of any movie. In filmmaking, the establishing shot is like the first shot you see in any scene. And in that first shot, like this is from The Walking Dead, like immediately you're struck with like, okay, some shit has gone down here. There's a hero or some character, walking into this mayhem, into this city. God knows what they're going to find there. Now, this is obviously a more apocalyptic and depressing story than the ones you're going to want to tell, but this is such a great establishing shot. It gives someone immediately, like they're starting to pattern match. They're starting to think, what should I expect to see next? And your goal is to set that frame of reference so you can have them expecting the right things and asking the right questions. Far too often, people start with what their company does. And this is important. It's important to be clear about this. It's important to have a real concise response and understanding of what your company does. But what your company does is not why somebody is going to invest. Unless, of course, they're so ultra focused on this topic and have been looking for just this one special opportunity of exactly that thing that you do. And that happens. If you have a thesis-driven investor that spent a lot of time in the space, you get lucky. And I think many of you are lucky to have Khosla as an investor, as a deeply technical investor that's willing to take a lot of risk and often invest based on the what. But I think most people and most investors invest based on the why. And the question you have to ask yourself constantly is, why should an investor care about what I'm doing? Why is this important to them? I gave this advice last year, and it's worth repeating. The immediate instinct when you're getting ready to go fundraise or develop a pitch is to power up your Keynote or your PowerPoint or Figma or Google Slides or whatever it is, pull out your old deck or start with a clean slate and just start making slides. I think that is a huge mistake. Slides are the output of a process of developing a really good message. They reinforce and amplify that message visually. But if you think you're going to have success just starting with visuals and starting with some old deck, I think it's a big mistake. And it's the default. I mean, I'm guilty of this. I've done this before. And it's easier because you know that's the end result that you need. You need the pitch deck. Somebody's asking for the pitch deck. You know that everybody's going to want that. But that is not a good way to start your process. A good way to start your process is with language, with words. And when I work with clients, this is actually one of the first things I do. They may not see it because it's a lot more exciting to like see a first glimpse at something that's more complete. But often what I'm doing in the background is like, okay, like literally blank sheet of paper, 5 bullets. How do I describe why this company matters in 5 bullets, right? And so, and one other thing about slides have this awful tendency to just stick around forever. They have a huge amount of inertia, and so like, I don't know if you've experienced this, but and how many rounds of capital you've raised, but there's probably a slide in your deck that really hasn't changed since the very beginning of the company, and that means that you haven't gone through this process, right? And so we're actually going to do this exercise, and we're going to do it at the beginning, and we're going to do it at the end, and then if some of you are brave souls, I'll invite you up and we can talk about it and just go back and forth and get a bunch of audience participation here. So what I want you to do is take out your phones, open up just like a blank notes document or a blank email, whatever it is, and try to answer this question very specifically to your company is why do you think an investor should care about your company and what you're doing? So I'm going to set a timer. I'm going to give you 3 minutes of condensed thinking time. And then we're going to talk about it. All right, so we have your baseline. We're not going to talk about it yet, okay? Keep it in your pocket, keep it in your mind, and we're going to repeat this at the end. So just think about what you wrote and pay attention to what we're going to talk about, and just keep it in the back of your mind. Okay. First of all, I totally made this up. So what I'm about to show you is not an exhaustive list. It's not the definitive truth. It is not, none of them are mutually exclusive. But as I thought about a lot of the work I do with companies and some of the intuition that I've brought from just years of doing this and seeing a lot of companies, this is kind of the list I came up with. I figured I could all make them start with P, so I did. But this is, you're not going to see this anywhere else, okay? So don't take it too seriously, but I think it's a helpful framework. I'm going to go through all 6 of these. And on the left side are things that relate to your company. And on the right side are things that relate to you as an entrepreneur. And when investors are assessing an opportunity, they are looking at both of these things. They are always looking at not just the company I'm investing in, but the horse I'm backing, you know? And you might be surprised that sometimes investors make non-economic investment decisions, and that's important to appreciate. Sometimes investors want to be in a company because they want the affiliation. They're logo hunting. Sometimes investors want to be in a company because they're curious about a space, but they're not committed to writing a big check yet, so they're going to write a little check just to learn. Sometimes they want the potential option value, if you're a really early company, of writing a small check so that maybe they can write a bigger check later. You've probably experienced some of this behavior if you're early stage companies. Sometimes they invest just based on a person. Sometimes they invest just based on an idea. But let's toss some of that aside for a second and just assume that we're focused on investors who want to make an economic investment decision. Those factors matter and play into like fundraising dynamics and closing rounds and getting extra investors and all of those things. There's a whole bunch of psychology in that. But I want to just focus on the core of it, which is you're trying to find a lead investor, someone who's making an economic decision, okay? They think this is going to be worth a lot more money someday, and you're trying to convince them of that. So the first thing, and these are not in any particular order, this is just how I came up with it, so don't prioritize based on this order. But one useful tool is the idea of precedent. To make somebody believe something could happen in the future, it's helpful to provide the framing of this has happened in the past. It's possible that this could happen again. Here's an example from a company that I met quite a while ago. And it was a marketplace business focused on the idea of lost and found. I shared this example last year. And, you know, kind of wild idea, out of left field, interesting. And like, how are you going to get somebody excited about that? There's like so much risk and uncertainty. And they gave, I think, a great example of precedent, actually 2 examples of precedent to help somebody mentally cross that gap. The first was that if you look at the homepage of Craigslist, for almost every one of these categories, you have some like pretty sizable marketplace business that has been built. All except for this one of lost and found. It's like very helpful framing. Whether that's even true or not, I don't know, but it immediately anchored you to the idea that there's precedent of companies identifying these niches and building big businesses around them. And the second piece of precedent this entrepreneur referred to was that in Japan, approximately 80% of lost items are returned to their rightful owners because the country has a nationalized and incentivized system for returning lost property. There's like a finder's fee and like a whole system. And that makes you think for a second, like, well, wait a second. If this system has already been built somewhere else in some other form, and if other people have created a lot of value going after these categories on Craigslist, maybe there's an opportunity to create value here. So that was an interesting example of precedent that I liked, and I thought it was very clever. Here's another example, and this is very specifically around anchoring to the idea of creating value. This is an orthodontics technology company. I don't include the name here, but they're working on a really cool new way to straighten teeth. That's awesome. You know, they will convince you of that in the pitch, but one of the opening frames of the pitch is this. And you know, I'm showing you the slides because it's helpful to show the slides, but focus on the words. You know, the words, the language, this is what matters. The last major innovation in this field created a tremendous amount of market value. A line is now worth, maybe it's 20 now, I don't know. But at the time was 40 billion. I mean, at one point was probably like 60 or 80. Incredible growth trajectory, incredible company. It's possible. You think this thing is crazy? You think this thing that like we're talking about, it's like, oh, all these risks. How are you going to do that? How are you going to do this? Someone did it before. They said, we're going to put freaking plastic in the mouth and straighten people's teeth invisibly. And people said the same exact thing. And now it's a $40 billion company. We can do it too, you know? And so this is precedent. I think another one, and this is related to this idea I spoke about last year of capturing attention, is having some kind of unique perspective that they haven't heard before. Investors are like super short on attention. They've seen 1,000 ideas. They are kind of just waiting for you to tell them something interesting that they haven't heard. Here's an example of this. Fission has been around for a long time. I was working with a fission company, a lot of challenges in doing anything in nuclear and in nuclear energy. And a lot of people are talking about fusion today, and they really want to lean into fission. And they're like, well, you know, if you really care about building carbon-free energy, there's a solution right in front of us. It's a scalable form of baseload power that nobody's paying attention to. It's like the safest form of energy generation. It's like fully no carbon emissions. There's a waste issue, which we can talk about. But they open their pitch basically with this, which is like, just, I want you to imagine for a second that fission were discovered, not in the context of nuclear weapons, whatever, but fission for power generation were discovered last week. It would be on the cover of every major magazine around the world. It would be hailed as a miracle. We figured out how to make unlimited amounts of power from minerals in the ground. Like, it's insane. It's this miraculous thing. And so they open with this perspective of like, if you can make the world see this, like if you can make people appreciate this, it causes them to pay attention. Here's another one, another energy example, a company I recently got introduced to through the Khosla portfolio. Really cool company in the geothermal space, right? And I was talking to him, and he's telling me a lot about his technology, and you know, it's really cool. There's this like underneath our feet is this unlimited energy resource in the form of heat of the Earth, not all the way down at the core, but much closer to the surface. They're particularly going after these things called super hot rocks, which are hotter and have higher energy density and are within the range of our current drilling tools. And he's telling me all about the technology and how they're making these high temperature sensors and new well completion technology to be able to access this stuff. And I said, okay, I'm like asking all these questions, I'm like trying to wrap my head around it, and then I sat on it for a while, and we came back and we had the conversation. I was like, let me get this right. And he came out of the oil and gas industry. Oil and gas is like the enemy in VC right now. Like nobody's talking about it. It's like the worst. And like everything they've done for climate is lip service. Nobody believes that like oil and gas actually cares. His premise is that if oil and gas had something that they could actually do that related to their core skill set, they would jump on it if it was economic. And so the premise is that if we succeed as a company, we can take the heft and capital and talent and technology of this enormous industry that drills 15,000 wells a year to get oil and gas, to shift over a little bit and start drilling for this renewable resource that's completely carbon-free and really accelerate the change to a clean energy future. And so the perspective isn't we're doing this cool thing, not the what, but the why are we doing this? We are doing this to try to channel the huge scale and resources of this industry to this incredible new opportunity. I really like that company. This one's kind of obvious, but so many people forget about it. And it's like, if you have performance, lead with it. And I think that performance can be misconstrued for just, how fast your revenue grew, like what's your month-over-month user growth rate. But performance can be a lot of things. Like remember, investors are looking for something that's growing quickly. I remember when Lux made its investment in Hugging Face, which is like an AI company, the metric that they touted and that prior to I had never heard of was how many stars on GitHub they had. And that's what they had going for them at the time. There was no money, there were no partners. It was like, we have the fastest growing and highest number of stars ever on GitHub for this repository. And that was impressive, and that's what they led with, and that's what they convinced a lot of people around, like, this is worth paying attention to. It was the performance around their core segment adopting this product. Performance can also be related to the product that you're building and like an amazing demonstration. If you have some freaking unbelievable robot or something really cool to show for it, there is absolutely nothing wrong with highlighting that, and you should. I heard a story from Vinod last night when there was a company here, I don't know, I think it must be a KV portfolio company, I guess they had some kind of robot dog, I don't know if anybody saw it outside, but he said they came and did a demonstration. I don't know if this was like pre or post pitch, but they turned this thing on and it like navigated around the whole garage around their office and went like back behind this area they didn't even know they could go, and then it like went upstairs all by itself and navigated, and it came down and realized the stairs were too steep, and it like turned around by itself and found another way downstairs. And he's like, that's when we decided to invest. It was the performance of something they had built, not the financial performance of the company, not the pitch. It was performance of something like really spectacular. Here's an example from a company that Lux was involved with quite a while ago called Oris that was demonstrating the performance of a new robotic system, an endoscopy system for navigating the lung. And they put together this really great demo showing their robot successfully navigating a fake plastic kind of lung pathway, which was really difficult to do. And this company did something pretty cool. I mean, they had a lot going for them. The founder was Fred Moll, who was the founder of Intuitive Surgical. And they also used the idea of precedent in their pitch. They had performance of this really cool demo, but it wasn't clear what the exact product was going to be yet. There's this long path of like high risk ahead of them. And the pitch was, and this was kind of an inside baseball pitch that investors were giving, was Intuitive is worth $60 billion. If there's a 10% chance that this could be the next Intuitive, and it helps that they had the founder of Intuitive as the founder of this company, and also an amazing demo, this should be a $6 billion company, discounted net present value 10 years, so like multi-billion-dollar company today. And from an investor standpoint, you can kind of like back of the envelope look at that and be like, yeah, why not? We'll invest at $1 billion valuation, like if it should be worth 6. Turns out the company actually got acquired for $6 billion, like a few years after that by Johnson & Johnson. Not in market yet, but like that's the story, that's the message, that's what got people excited and convinced and believing. So now I'm shifting from things about your company to things about you. First is passion. Like I think if you have enthusiasm for an idea, I mean, you just heard Jose Andres like on the stage, like the guy just exudes passion for what he's doing. He's very compelling. He's also a great storyteller, which is another important topic that I talked about last year. And I don't know if it was him or Mark Esper who gave the Winston Churchill quote, but another famous historical figure who gave this quote, which I liked: "Flaming enthusiasm, backed up by horse sense," which at the time meant common sense, I guess, because everybody had to know how to use horses or something, "and persistence is the quality that most frequently makes for success." And I agree with that. I think enthusiasm is infectious. It is something that people believe in. And I remember this moment when I was in a partner meeting, and there was an entrepreneur who came in, and they were so passionate about what they were doing, and they were so convincing in their belief in this product. It was a hardware product company. It was not like a particularly attractive market. It was a difficult sell, expensive product. Hardware is hard. There was like no real recurring revenue plan. It was like all the reasons were there to like ignore this thing, not invest. He was so passionate and so convincing in what he was doing that I remember this moment that I almost took a step back and was like, what's going on here? Because every person in the room was captivated by this guy, and we would not let him leave until he signed a term sheet. Didn't do any diligence. It was like, that was it. I mean, of course, there was like follow-up diligence and work, but like the decision had been made in that room. And that happens all the time, and I don't think people appreciate that often. Decisions are made in an instant and then rationalized later on. There's like a moment where someone's like, I want to do this, and then they figure out how to get it done. If you can't get that, it's a much more difficult process. This was an extreme example of that, but like his enthusiasm and his passion for this idea went so far, and I think has carried the company really far. And that was a bet that we were making. It wasn't just on this product, it was on him. It was like, if he's this good in this meeting, he's going to be so good in other meetings. He's going to be so good at promoting this product and promoting this company. He is going to help drive this thing to success. That passion and that pitch that he has is going to help this thing propel. And so that was one of the investment theses in the company, which was he and his passion is going to make this better. I also like this quote by Kevin Kelly. I just recently came across: "Enthusiasm worth 25 IQ points." Totally agree. Pedigree. This is something you see all the time. It's kind of like a natural instinct that a lot of people have, which is talking about the companies that they came from. I just did this fun thing. It's like a Google exercise, literally like, in quote, team of ex-SpaceX engineers, like on the hunch that like I would come up with like, literally the story of the startup is that these people came from SpaceX. That's the headline. Former SpaceX engineers raised $7.5 million. Former SpaceX engineers build whatever. They are leveraging their pedigree to raise capital and get attention. This happens all the time. Investors are constantly, it's like a pattern matching and filtering mechanism. And so it's easier to rely on the mechanism of, even though I don't think it's a great proxy, by the way, this is how investors think. It's easy to rely on those filtering mechanisms that have presumably done the work for you. By the way, this is like why the whole college system exists. It's like, so you can put freaking Cornell or Harvard or MIT or Yale on your resume because it's going to be easier to get that meeting with that person you want, because they're like, oh, they must be smart. They went to MIT and they went to Cornell. Like, this is pedigree, right? And it's important that if you have pedigree or if your company has pedigree, that you use that to tell your story. And the final thing I wanted to just talk about is perseverance. I was really struck by Tony's conversation around DoorDash, and you hear these stories, and like you've probably lived some of this personally. Like, building companies is hard. Sometimes it goes smoothly, but most of the time, and even for the most successful companies, it can be a really rough journey. And you talk to a lot of investors, and this is something that they look for, which is like, does this person have grit? Do they have hustle? Like, are they going to be able to endure this really challenging journey? And I want to tell you a story about a company that I invested in quite a while ago that I think really spoke to this, because this company didn't have much going for them. They had been in Y Combinator, so they had some pedigree, but they weren't a successful company in Y Combinator. They were kind of an odd duck. They hadn't really raised much money, and the idea that they came out of Y Combinator with had failed. It was a shopping technology company that didn't work, their first product. I had met them, and they had a unique perspective, which at the time, which was that, and this was when Amazon was launching these like just walk out stores, and Standard Cognition, I don't know if you ever heard of that company, was doing like these whole store checkout things where you could literally like walk out and like the thing would be charged already. And their whole thesis was, this does not make sense. Like, we've seen this technology, we tried to build this, there is no way that this is scalable. It doesn't work for like 15 different reasons. It's like a huge commitment on behalf of companies which are not these huge cash-rich businesses. They were particularly going after grocery at the time. These stores are massive. There's like no consistency across stores. Just the compute cost alone to do this was like extraordinary. You had to become completely dependent on a technology vendor for your like new checkout technology, and were screwed if it didn't work as a store. And so they listed like 15 reasons that this wouldn't make sense. And they had an idea to like basically package this computer vision technology inexpensively in a highly scalable and repeatable thing, which was a grocery cart, smart grocery cart, which on the surface is like not that interesting. It's like, oh, a smart grocery cart? Like, what the heck? Like, but they told a good story about what this could mean and what it could do for the industry. The idea that you could deploy just a few of them just to get started. It's very low risk for the retailer. Once you're in, there's so much more you can do. It's not just for checkout, but displaying ads, helping future Instacart shoppers navigate more effectively around the store. They can use their cameras to also take inventory while people are pushing them around the store. There's like all these things that you could build. You can imagine it not really as like a smart shopping cart, but a new type of digital retail platform. And I liked that story. I had been looking at the space. But that's not what made us write the check. What made us write the check was they told the story of their last year of existence, which was after they came out of Y Combinator and raised a little bit of money and failed with their first idea, they had like nothing. Like, they were running on fumes. And they got this new idea that they had high conviction in. They're like, we think this can work. We want to test this. They all decided to save money. They would live in a house together in some like really crappy area of New York City. It was a New York City-based company. So like really cheap house. They were eating like rice and beans every night. They were flying on like the cheapest flights they could find to China to like help prototype, and had managed to create a prototype of this pretty sophisticated and hard to build technology and actually sell it and have one running at a local grocery store in New York on like the $300,000 they had left or whatever it was. And they told that story, and we saw the demo, you heard the store owner, it was still raw, like there were issues, but it worked. And you look at these guys, and I'm like, you guys are gonna run through walls to make this happen. Like, you are never gonna give up. And we ended up leading the check and writing the check and leading their Series A. I was on the board. Long story short, this company got bought by Instacart for $350 million. And the cool part about it to me is that, I don't know if anybody's been following the headlines, but Amazon recently announced that they are pulling out of the Just Walk Out technology. So their thesis was right. And Instacart just announced that they are all in on the carts and are expanding them to tons of stores. It's like key to their future advertising platform. It's a really big deal for them. Like, we probably could have gotten more money in the sale, is what I learned. But these guys were amazing. And like, that demonstrated grit and perseverance was something that we cared about. And that story that they told is how they demonstrated that perseverance. And it wasn't something that they were even proud of or necessarily like aware that that's the vibe that they were giving off, but that's what convinced us. And to me, that's what was really compelling. Okay, I'll put the list back up so you can see it again to reference. But I want to do the same exercise now, 3 minutes. Try to keep it to 5 or less bullets, and then we're going to do some interactive stuff. There are people like me who can help you and kind of give you new ideas, but ultimately, there's going to be a moment when you just have to keep testing and iterating and figuring out what works. And these are all frameworks to help, but it's going to take some time to like really find the message that is landing. And when you find that message, you will know, because the reaction you will see in people will be completely different than what you've experienced before. You may have had this happen to you already, where like somebody just groks with your idea and they're like, I get it, I'm in. But oftentimes what I find is like investors are bored or confused, or like they ask the wrong questions or the ones that aren't the important questions that you really know. And it's a communications problem. It's getting them in the right frame of mind so that they can see and understand this thing the way you do. They can understand why you're building this, but from their frame of view, from their perspective, which is why is this thing going to be big? Why does this have a chance of being a really important and valuable company one day? And so I don't want you to feel pressure that like in this 1 5-minute exercise, you're going to have like the perfect pitch. That's very unlikely to happen. The goal is really just to get you to start thinking about this and going through this process of like redrafting, rewriting, trying on somebody, like saying it out loud, because that's the only way you're going to get better. Last year I did a talk on the main stage last year. It ended with a pitch that I thought was very good by Palmer Luckey of Anduril, which is a defense tech company. And I kind of broke it down and all the elements I thought were good. You can watch the talk online. But I ended by saying, like, you look at this pitch and you're like, wow, that was good. But what I say is if you think that this was just like off the cuff, the first pitch and the one that like he started with, you are so wrong. This has been practiced and polished and rehearsed and tested and changed 100 times to get to the current variation. It could be one little word that changed at one point that made a big difference, or it could be the whole framing of the story. Every time was truthful and authentic to like his purpose and what he was doing, but it was about figuring out that combination of ideas and words that got somebody immediately to understand why this was big and important, why they should pay attention, why they should trust him. And it's a really beautiful thing to see when it's working right, but it's really hard to get right. And you have to be willing to invest the time to do it. And so if there's one thing you can take away from this, it's like these are some helpful frameworks. Go test, take these ideas, go practice on your trip home, or when you get to bed tonight. Just spend like 5 minutes trying something new. There's no risk when you're by yourself. And test with close contacts, friends. Like find somebody you can talk to on your team or a family member where like, I just want to try something new on you. No slides, just words, and see how it goes. And if they're like kind of looking at you in confusion, you know it's not right. But if all of a sudden they're like leaning in and being like, oh wow, like that makes so much sense, or like asking really interesting and good questions, you know you're on the right path. And it's something tangible that you can feel. People lean in. When I told my story at the beginning, like all of you were leaning in. Like I knew that I was making sense for this audience, right? And your goal is to make sense for the investor audience. So. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. Again, the absolute best part of my job is getting to work with all of you. So feel free to reach out. My contact info is readily available. You can ask the Khosla team how to get in touch with me. You can reach out directly. You can find me on LinkedIn. You can find my website. I would love to talk with you. And thank you so much. I'm around for the rest of the day if anybody wants to chat.